Hi everybody, I'm here with Dr. Stanley Porter, and Dr. Porter is a member of Mount Hamilton, which we're happy about, and he is a great resource in our mix. Stan is a New Testament scholar, and he is also the president of McMaster Divinity School, where lots of us went and did our training to learn all the stuff that we are still teaching. And what I thought would be really helpful during this new season where we're learning about Matthew is to do a series of short videos where I can ask Stan some of those background questions that he would be able to give real insight towards that would help us learn more about the book of Matthew and the things we're learning. So we're going to put different ones up every few days and each week, and I'm excited. How about you, Stan?
Oh, I'm excited about it too. Thank you. Yeah, great opportunity.
So I'm going to start with our first video, and the topic is, who was Matthew and what do we know about him? So before you answer, Stan, we're going to be looking for the next number of months at one of these books in the Bible called the Book of Matthew. And all of us might know someone named Matthew, but who is this Matthew guy that this book is named after? And do we know very much about him? So tell us about Matthew, Stan.
Okay, well, thank you, Leanne. Yeah, we don't really know that much about Matthew. We really don't. All of the Gospels, all four of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are what we call formally anonymous. So that means that there isn't actually a direct attribution of an author to any of the books. But history tells us something about who the authors are. And there's several lines of evidence that we can look at. Matthew's Gospel was traditionally the most popular gospel in the early church, and that's probably why it's listed first in our biblical order: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so Matthew, from the 2nd century on, there's evidence in some of the manuscripts, some of the early church fathers, the kinds of attestation that we have that there's this person, Matthew, that the gospel was written according to some of the languages, according to Matthew.
Do we know when that started to get written down with this gospel?
Well, the titles of gospels probably date back to the 2nd century. So it's pretty early evidence. And we have some fragmentary gospels where they would have some of these headings attached to them. And so we know that these headings were attached in the early church. But we also have a lot of evidence from the early church fathers who talk about them. Eusebius records material from some earlier writers who talk about the Gospels.
So by that you mean that other people who were writing at the time would refer to it as having been written by Matthew.
That's right. So they refer to a Matthew or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, but within the Gospel itself then, we do find somebody who is a Matthew. Matthew, who's a tax collector in Matthew 9, and then in Matthew 10, the 70 who are sent out, and they talk about the disciples at that particular point and mention Matthew again. And then it seems that that is the Matthew to whom the gospel is attributed. Seems like then he probably would have been a Jewish tax collector, and probably a tax collector who worked in the employ of some higher government authorities, possibly the Romans. And then he would have been responsible for collecting taxes, or there was a local toll collector or some other kind of taxation. Probably would have been a very unpopular person because tax collecting back then was more about getting as much as you could from the people you taxed, rather than simply well, that was where your profit came from, is the amount you got over what the government required. So he would have been very unpopular, but he also would have been a person who quite possibly would have had some education, would have had to be able to keep his accounts, to be able to correspond with the authorities. So in a position to probably write down a gospel because he would have literacy.
He would have been smart.
That's right.
How did they choose tax collectors? Do we know?
Well, it was actually through a competitive bidding system. And so it seems, yes. So the way the bidding system worked was that there was a certain amount of taxation that was needed by the government.
By the Romans.
The Romans, but there were other local taxation as well. And so the general scheme was probably that this amount was needed, and then there would maybe be some kind of a tendering process, and then you would be able to promise them more than that. And so that would be appealing.
You'd say, I could get more for you.
I can get more, and then you try to get more than that, because that would be your amount that you would keep once you paid the debts that you then owed for getting the contract.
That's right.
So it made for a very abusive system, right? Because obviously the taxing authority would want to get as much as they could. They needed a minimum amount, but they'd like more.
Yes. So Matthew, the Matthew that's talked about in the book of Matthew,
Yes.
that you mentioned that we meet in Matthew 9 when it says Jesus called him and said, "Follow me" at the tax collector's booth. So we know that Matthew was a tax collector and listed as a disciple. And at some point, someone attributed that gospel as him having written it down. We assume that they're the same Matthew.
Right, and by the 2nd century, it seems that this was in sometime in the 2nd century, a received tradition. That's right. And probably one of the reasons Matthew's gospel was as popular as it was is because this Matthew would have been a disciple, right? And so one of that relatively close circle of Jesus' followers. If you look at Mark and Luke, the other so-called synoptic gospels, the gospels that seem to be telling a somewhat similar story at the same time, he would have been the only of the three that was a disciple.
That's right.
And so that would have probably helped to give it a special position.
So as we end this particular question about who Matthew was, what difference do you think it makes that this Matthew would have written it down, or that we think he wrote it down? How is that relevant to us when we read it today?
Well, I happen to think that the traditional ascriptions of the gospel authors, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are accurate. And so that would tell us that this Matthew was a couple of things. One, he was a disciple of Jesus. And so a lot of the things that he's writing down are things that he would have witnessed.
Yeah,
he
saw with his own eyes.
Saw with his own eyes. He was in that group that went through. And so that's very good.
Heard the Sermon on the Mount.
Heard the Sermon on the Mount, saw all the events, the other teaching that Jesus did, which is phenomenal. But then also that he would have been in a position to have actually been able to have recorded it and to taken it down, because he was a person who was used to keeping track of things, right? As a tax collector, he had to keep track of things.
And probably good at detail.
Probably good at detail. So he had to be able to write these things down, just the way he would keep his account books accurate to see what he'd collected. He can take down the account of what went on with Jesus.
Well, thank you, Stan. That's a great insight into our author of our book that we're looking at. Thanks. We'll see you next time.